All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. This week, I have a guest on the show who, this will be his third time total on an LCI program. His name is Stephen Wolfe. Stephen is an author and political philosopher. He's known for his work on Christian nationalism, and he talks a lot about Reformed political theology. He's contributed to discussions on the role of religion in public life, exploring how Christian principles can inform political and social structures. His notable work is his book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, where he argues for an integration of Christian values within the governance of a nation. Stephen, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, of course. Like I said, this is your third overall appearance on a Libertarian Christian Institute podcast. It's the second time you and I are talking. We had a group discussion, you, me, and Alex, and then you were recently on Alex's show, which is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. So I don't think we're going to do too much reintroduction or retreading of ground. This is kind of like a part 3 of sorts, and if people are watching this and haven't watched the other 2 conversations, I'd recommend they go do that, because there'll be a lot of defining of terms and sort of uncovering of a lot of the common ground and particulars of your worldview and whatnot in those conversations. So I don't want to, just rehash all of that at the beginning. I feel like, we'll kind of pick up where things left off and kind of just build on the momentum. Before we dive into it, I wanted to see if we agree on the general spirit of the discussion. We have our disagreements for sure, but I've been frustrated that a lot of your critics have been very unfair in their coverage of you, and that's if they cover you at all, because some people will you're like Voldemort to them. They'll just mention Christian nationalists, and you can tell they're kind of talking about you, but they won't say your name. I know when we talked that you expressed there were a couple spots where maybe we misunderstood things you said, but I hope you feel as we get into this conversation that Alex and I have been earnestly trying to understand and represent your positions and engage in good faith. And are there areas where you're surprised, perhaps, of certain areas of agreement or disagreement with Christian libertarians such as Alex and I?
That's a good question. Surprised that there's a agreement. I'm not entirely sure. I in some ways I'm very sympathetic to old style, I guess, classical liberalism from the founding and the early republic. So I generally speaking want a reduced government, so a small government, a limited government. I just don't in principle think that must be the case. I think that some people, given their circumstances and characteristics, probably need a more heavy-handed government to maintain order. But yeah, ideally, I am for a limited, small government when the people themselves culturally believe in a sort of like an ordered liberty. So I've always said that liberty is the ideal situation, but it must come with order. And that order is essentially brought in by the characteristics of the people and the culture. So I think there's overlap there. I just wouldn't be, I suppose, a sort of limited government, small government absolutist. I just see that as a sort of target that we would want to attain, but not something that's absolutely.
Like all things being equal, you would prefer government be smaller if possible from your position. Is what you're saying, rather than bigger, but it would depend. And I would agree insofar as that I'm often saying that I do think limited government is something we should pursue in all contexts, but I've always said it, which is similar to what you said this way, that we won't have limited government if we don't have a people capable of governing themselves, of ordering their own individual lives. And so anytime liberals, classical or otherwise, or libertarians try to divorce limited government from personal responsibility and virtue, they're not going to get limited government. You're going to sort of, there's that saying, you're going to get the government you deserve, so to speak. And I think that tends to play out as being what happens.
Yeah, I mean, just even the local level. So I live kind of out in the country in a rural area, and there's building restrictions that the county's placed on us, and some are good, or I'd say most are good for what we want. But I think also that, like, just culturally, there's a sense that it wouldn't be appropriate to build right across the street from me this giant Chevron station with lights going all over the place. So there's also that fittingness aspect. I think for the most part, if we could kind of regulate ourselves as these little rural communities, we would already kind of have a sense of what's fitting, what's suitable, without the government. So that's kind of what I mean, is just sense that what would be suitable, what would be proper given our understanding of our place. And that can be very self-regulated, or you can, actually use government to do it. But it's preferable that I would have the expectation of my neighbor, and he would have that expectation of me, that I wouldn't create a sort of horrible structure that disrupts the neighborhood itself aesthetically, and so yeah.
And I know you also agree that a law has to be enforceable. So there is kind of there is a point of like a critical mass of sorts, where if something is, even if you say this is how things should be, well, if too much of the population disagrees, then it wouldn't be prudent to try to force it, even though you might say that it's permissible in the abstract to enforce. And I think a lot of people miss that about your position, that you're often making two statements. You're kind of outlining what can we do and what is permissible, but then you'll also, make considerations about what is prudent in terms of what is going to work out in the long term. And I feel like even if I disagree with you in some of those calculations, I at least want to give you that credit and engage with what you're actually saying, rather than straw man you as a lot of people will mischaracterize you as a theonomist, or as a extreme authoritarian who just wants to put people in power and just immediately pass a litany of laws enforcing a bunch of things that you would probably agree on day one of if you were starting to initiate a Christian nationalist agenda, they're probably not going to be things that, even if you want to get there eventually, you can't just automatically poof them into existence and expect them to be enforceable.
Yeah, I think that political life is not, it's not simply a sort of blueprint that you're given from on high, that now it's our obligation to just enact it. It's not all theonomists think like this, but some simply think that we have a set of laws and we must enact them, and that's our obligation, regardless of the conditions on the ground. And really, there's no political life at all in that sense. There's just simply a type of social life that with laws that we just follow. But I think politics is far more a matter of deliberation. It's a matter of thinking upon what the conditions are on the ground, and then using different sources for law and ethical principles. So from scripture to just your own experience in the world. Will this work? Will this make things better? Will this make things worse? A good law in itself could actually make things worse, because in effect it produces more evil than good. So politics is a difficult task of understanding the conditions on the ground, and then sources of ethics and moral principles that you then apply to enact the best possible good given the circumstances. So I think it's more of a human, it's a divine thing in its fundamental source and origin of principles, but it's also a very human thing of organizing human society to actually bring about actual good. And I think, the theonomists and others, not just theonomists, I would say the way Christians usually think in the modern and nowadays is to think, well, a law is either good or bad, and that's it, and we must enact it without consideration of, the actual effect it creates. That's kind of I think that's a classical way to understand it. It's not just Aristotelian. It's also just the basic way that I think Protestants and Roman Catholics have thought about law and society. as a type of human thing informed by divine principles, undergirded in its source by things divine. But then ultimately, it's us deliberating upon the good and enacting what's good for the good of society.
That's a good segue into one of the questions I wanted to really ask you about, because we touched on the surface of this, and I want to dive deeper, because I think one of your disagreements with how Alex and I sort of form our political philosophy is that you might think we're pulling too much from the Bible to inform our political philosophy. I think you stated here, if I have the quote right, the Bible is not really aimed at politics, and that these are things that we come to conclusions, based on more considering things like natural law and the study of philosophy and using reason. Although you did also say that, there are certain biblical principles that come into effect as well. Could you touch on where you think, would you describe it as like the Bible maybe establishes certain minimal parameters of, for governance, and then the rest is sort of we work it out ourselves? Like, how would you formulate that, and what biblical principles, I guess, would be in play?
Yeah, I think it starts with what politics is in itself, which is it's a human thing, like I said before. And the source for the way we order ourselves, whether it's a customs or its laws, are going to be, it's going to come from our own, it's going to come essentially from reason, experience, and scripture. And ultimately, those are going to inform how we should best arrange and order ourselves. And so you have to have the experience not only of your own life or your own people's life, but also the lives of people in the past who have also ordered fallen human societies as well. And this has worked, or that hasn't worked, or this sort of magistrate is good, or this sort of magistrate is bad. And we can reflect upon that kind of experience on what'll work. I think reason as well, just trying to understand just both the human nature and also both fallen and good, and also scripture itself. Because scripture, like when you read the Ten Commandments is a summary of the law of God, but that law of God existed prior to the codification or the inscripturation of that law. The law was prior. You can call it the natural law or the moral law or whatever it was, whatever you want to call it. It's speaking to the same thing. And so when we look to scripture for ethical or political principles, we have to understand that we're looking at an inscripturated human thing or natural things that are inscripturated, so it's there, we can read it in propositions, and also examples from sacred politics, from First, Second Kings and First, Second Samuel. And you can use that to apply to the circumstances on the ground to enact the common good. So that's how. So in other words, it's a complicated, it's a complex situation of, again, the particulars with these different sources upon which we can deliberate to enact the best possible good.
Sure. So I kind of agree in essence that although biblical, I think biblical principles do play a lot into this. I mean, I think Christian libertarians commonly cite passages like 1 Samuel 8, where God kind of reprimands them for asking for a king, which he later echoes in, I think it's Hosea 11 through 13, where God's sort of speaking through the prophet to be like, here's all the ways you've, I rescued you, I called you out of Egypt, I did all these, things to make you my people, and then you rejected me continually, and I gave you a king in my wrath. And so a lot of Christian libertarians look to that and try to pull a principle out of there of well, maybe God's making a statement to where maybe there's an issue with, instituting too much power into a civil magistrate. Because we would agree, I'm not I don't know, an anarchist of the type that would say that we should have a society of lawlessness. No, you and Alex covered that actually Rothbardian libertarianism is actually, some people actually, a lot of the left anarchists will say that Rothbardians aren't real libertarians because your system has more rules than the current system, which is, kind of true in a sense, but still we think that power should be decentralized, and if it's centralized too much into one apparatus or person, not only do we have, things from natural law or reason that we could say, there could be an issue there, but there seems to be a biblical principle where God seems to be communicating through certain passages that if too much power is given to these earthly rulers, that it robs from him, and it's going to lead to, like he calls it in First Samuel 8, like our own enslavement, essentially, that we're going to be, it reminds me so much of what we live in today, right? Where he says that you're going to go fight on the front lines of his wars. And I'm like, well, okay, well, right now we live under the American empire, and our children are often, maybe not drafted anymore, but still they're heavily, coerced and indoctrinated to go out and fight on the front lines of George Bush's wars or Barack Obama's wars or, Joe Biden's wars, right? And they're not actually wars that, you or I would agree with under a, Christian just war theory. And so I wonder, would you agree, at least, maybe in the general view, that there's a sentiment there that we should be factoring? Like, I understand what you're saying, that it is kind of this, balancing of different considerations and factors. Would you agree that some of what I just highlighted here is one of the factors that needs to be at play when we're talking about what Christians should be advocating for in terms of political structures and civil life?
Yeah, this is where perhaps there's kind of disagreement where, yeah, I think libertarians tend to have I would say, is not theonomist, but is a type of absolutist understanding of of power, so that they want to limit power from the very kind of at the abstract level. What I would say, that actually the civil power ordained of God in the abstract is actually extremely extensive, and but that power then is curtailed through a constitutional order. And I mean, you can see this. This is pretty much the theme of Livy's history of Rome, that it starts off as kings, and it goes and it turns into the Roman Republic, and it's kind of a battle between the elites and the commoners to form this constitution that essentially becomes the Roman Republic. And again, that's a kind of experience I mean when we kind of go back and reflect upon political order, and we look at what in the end, what sort of arrangement has then permitted enough kind of robust power to ensure that the good is enacted, but also have a kind of restraints on power to make sure it's not abused. And so that's why I think politics, in its, I guess, architectonic sense, is arranging power so that it can be used for the good. And that's why I think the American founders, this is why they had a sense of power in the abstract, but they said, okay, we got to divide it between executive, legislative, and judicial, and that those powers separated are going to be placed in different branches, and they're going to have checks upon one another. That's just taking political power in the abstract and enacting it through a constitutional order. And so that's what I would say, is that we can distinguish between the sort of absolute power, but then funneled through a constitutional order. And that's how I would make that distinction. So I would say, like, in principle or in theory, there's absolute sort of power, not absolute. I mean, there's limits to it, of course, but there's extensive power. But then the job of political order is to maintain an order through which that power is brought about. And we just have our system is very complex. We have, the federal system, we have different branches of government, and then at the state level, then county. And I think in general, in theory, that is good, or it was good. So I think that would be the difference. Again, I want to place politics at the like, remove it from the theory of abstractions as much as possible, to then place it within the realm of, it sounds silly, but in the realm of the human, like, or on the ground, in human interaction, in the different dynamics between rich and poor, and the dynamics between elite and non-elite, and how those interact, sometimes adversarially, to produce a more just order. So So I want to, again, like I want to take it away from like have the theory, have the philosophy, but then also understand the fundamental particular nature of political order. And I mean, and just going back to like 1 Samuel 8, I think the problem is, again, you're establishing a monarch over the different tribes of Israel, and there really weren't constitutional limits in place except for the law itself, but the idea of having a sort of constitutional monarchy that is just say the English Constitution developed, which is someone like Montesquieu would praise and call it a republic, though it's a constitutional monarchy. That he called that the true republic, as opposed to the France and elsewhere, precisely because it was filtered through constitutional order.
Right. So maybe we might still have some disagreement, but there might be an area here where we agree a little bit, and it might be slightly semantic. So let me make clear what I think 1 Samuel 8 would tell us. I don't think that it would necessarily be something that you should read and come away thinking that God doesn't want there to be people who should enact law. I don't even think that it necessarily would condemn monarchy in principle. I think it's two things. One, I think the consideration that you're bringing out is partly true, and I think that's part of God's warning, is that you're asking for a king like the other nations have, and this king isn't going to have the limits. He's going to abuse his power, and he's it's not going to be like you often say that government should be aimed at the good of the people, and what 1 Samuel 8 describes as the king's not going to be enacting what's good for society. But then I think there's also a flip side, which I think you would have to agree that it doesn't necessarily mean that a monarch has to do this, but that there's a tendency for the state to sometimes want to act as a sovereign in society and to sort of usurp some of the role that God, and maybe to a lesser extent that like church, should play in society. And so like I guess I read 1 Samuel 8 and I just see a lot of corollary to what's happening today, and even different times in history. It's like I can agree with you in a sense that you could conceive of a lot of different political systems that perhaps solve the problem of 1 Samuel 8, and I agree with you. Like I would say that the libertarian, anarcho-capitalist conception of governance that I happen to be more persuaded by, I think that's a form of governance that has laws and enforcement of laws in a way that doesn't wouldn't be something that God would be warning people about like he did in 1 Samuel 8. And you could probably construct limited monarchs in the same way. And I think even libertarians like Hans Hermann Hoppe in Democracy of the God That Failed have pointed out that there's actually a lot of ways in which there were monarchies that were more limited in their power than the sort of democratic liberal order we live in today. So I can agree with you in a sense there, but would you also, on the flip side, can you agree with me that there is a point where we can use maybe this biblical principle to critique government, to say like, hey, it can go too far when the power isn't filtered correctly, and it can go too far if it is being used to claim some sort of sovereignty that isn't due?
Yeah, I mean, if it in principle is violating, if it's doing something it cannot do in principle, so if it's like the classic Protestant, or actually this is just classic Christian example, would be a civil magistrate preaching the word as a preacher, as if a spiritual authority, as if having the sort of the spirit in principle. That would be something that they would violate the nature of civil power itself. So you have to. So there are I think there are limits in principle given what civil power is and what it can accomplish. So I would agree with that. So civil power in principle cannot force you to change a belief. It cannot force you to have an emotion. It cannot force you to fall in love with someone. It can't force you to do these things. And so in principle, it would be a violation of that power. But I just think in principle, civil power is saying do this or don't do that, and it has in an outward sense is not a violation of its power. Now the question is that good or bad? So I think it's a civil ruler calling people up for war to draft them or whatever is in principle a good use of civil power. But if it's to an evil end, if it's to an unjust war, that's a different question. So that's the difference between the power in principle and the power in use.
So you would make a differentiation between like the power itself isn't bad, but if it's used towards bad ends, it's bad. And I guess I would just
it's bad. It would be bad in use instead of So again, like I said earlier, I want to move it away from these sort of abstract principles as much as possible, and then bring that use of power down to the people itself or to the.
Do you think that? Do you think there might be a point that centralizing power might? Because I guess it's sort of a spectrum. I don't like using the word spectrum because the left uses it in such a awful way these days. But like I feel like power is sort of a spectrum, and would you agree that there might be a point of centralizing power where it would lend itself towards like the incentive structures would produce more using that power towards bad ends? Because I guess that's where my fundamental libertarian critique is that it's not that it's actually funny. I was in a debate a couple months ago with an Eastern Orthodox Christian nationalist, Andrew Wilson, and he was like, what if we had he was like, what if we, had centralized power and it only did good things? And I'm like, well, I'm not really if you could conceptualize to me like a very, like a Christian government that was enforcing only Christian things and doing it in a way that was, I don't know, not too authoritarian as to, or too heavy-handed as to produce other, like undesired ends or, more bad than good, that would be like fine in theory. I guess what I have a hard time making the jump in my mind is that it seems to me very unlikely that like once power gets centralized to a certain point, or if it's not filtered enough, like the way you put it, it feels like you're sort of stacking the deck of cards in the direction of the power will be used towards bad ends. So I guess that's sort of the
I agree with that. I think in general the idea that centralizing power without sufficient checks can often lead to bad outcomes, and so I agree with that. And but again, like that's precisely why the constitutional Western constitutionalism has been so important. And this was actually a very legitimate critique in my book that came out fairly early by a friend of mine, Glenn Moots, who's not only been a friend but a mentor academically, and I haven't always followed his advice, but he's been a good friend over the years, and he's a scholar who that does American founding and other things. And his criticism was I just didn't account for enough of Western constitutionalism. And in hindsight, I would have included that, where I said, like if I talk about the Christian prince with all these powers, and that was bound to be misunderstood. But if I had included something about what I've been saying today so far in this show, I think I would have been would have articulated my position better. But so I agree. You centralize power with one guy or one group of guys, and they easily devolve into tyranny and bad actors and sort of court people who manipulate them and manipulate power. So I 100% agree that there is a tendency for that. And that's again, not to repeat myself, but why power has to be put through some sort of first law or constitutional law that would then channel that power and to better outcomes than centralizing it.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And then we would just we could have a robust debate over if constitutionalism like we have in our American tradition is the best form of that, or might there be better filters that might work better, but we would at least agree that there's the need for some sort of funneling of power to make it less susceptible for the people in power to abuse it or be likely to use it towards bad ends. One thing I wanted to ask you about, and this is tricky because like so you have this view of governance that it exists pre-fall, which that's something that that's a theological debate that would take a long time to get into. I don't necessarily want to debate that, but I think that's what's informing your view, that you think. I think you and I have slightly different definitions of governance, whereas I tend to define it as for more of a, so I'm influenced a little bit more. I think I told you this last time we talked. I'm influenced more by, I guess, like Hyperion conception, where you have the idea of sphere sovereignty, and you have different spheres of society, and so you have the sphere of the family, you have the sphere of the church, and then I would say there's also the sphere of civil governance. And sometimes when you're talking, and this could be just a misunderstanding on my part, so it's a clarifying question to start out, and then there might be disagreement that follows. But sometimes the way you describe civil governance as being sort of like the functions of civil society and the ways in which we, it's the ways in which people organize themselves, and use it in the way that seems to have a scope that's beyond just the adjudication of law. And so it can almost seem like you're saying that government is not like in the conception that I would have, or a Hyperion reformed would have it, where it's just one sphere, but rather, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost seems like you're saying government is almost a broader sphere that these other spheres sort of, or different parts of civil society fit into, and government is sort of the culmination of all these different ways in which humans cooperate and organize and then, execute different parts of society. Do I have that right, or would you, hash that out a little bit differently?
Yeah, I'm not. I'm not a huge fan of the terminology of sphere sovereignty. I know that's probably going to rustle some feathers, I guess, but I think the political leader or the civil ruler power is greater, given that it's a lawmaking authority, even over the family, over the family unit as well. Again, in principle. So I don't want people to misunderstand that I'm calling for the kind of usurpation of family order as we understand it. But at the same time, there is. So I think nations or political things are a real thing. And civil power is a real thing. Also, that families themselves are real entities. So it's not just individuals, but it becomes a real thing with marriage and childbearing and having children. So and there is family or paternal authority there, and that ought to be recognized by the civil ruler. But the precise way in how those authorities interact and relate to one another, I think is open to a sort of a negotiation over time. And so this is why I don't like the idea of saying there's some sovereign thing here and sovereign thing there. But I would say there's just different authorities that have to have a sort of negotiated relationship, kind of on the ground. And these things actually happen. Like we tend to, like, because like we kind of are socialized into a type of relationship, and we kind of think that they're purely natural when we talk about sovereignty. But really, those are just arrangements that have been developed, kind of built over time. And so that's kind of how I see it. So and this is why like civil authority can enter into the domestic sphere when there's abuse or there's violence between people, or if there's child abuse or whatever, they can enter into that relationship and correct it using civil authority. But there really isn't that authority where family can then enter into and correct the civil ruler. So I do think that, yeah, it is a type of, that there are real authorities, there are real entities, but the precise way that they relate is going to be some kind of development in the political order itself. And that really, it really depends upon, I mean, really all this depends upon people being assertive in their various capacities in relation to one another and resolving those questions of authority and action. I mean, that's very kind of an abstract way to put it, but I don't know how else to put it. And this is why it could be very different in different places, and how we understand those various authorities. So I mean, that's really why I don't really, I think that like the idea of having this, using the terminology of sovereignty is, it, again, kind of absolutizes these relationships, when I think it's far more of a, let's just use the word negotiation.
Well, so I would agree, and as far as my understanding of sphere sovereignty goes, that yeah, there is interaction between the spheres, and there are, there is sort of a, you could describe it as checks and balances between them as well. So I agree that this, the way I would describe it is that the law, the sphere of law or civil governance, can correct the sphere of the family if the family is, yeah, like if there's abuse or something like that. But I think that there are things that would be sovereign to the family that the civil magistrate should never have a say over. Like, and I think you would agree with this. Like the civil magistrate shouldn't, probably come in and dictate that, the law of the land is infant baptism or pedo or credo baptism, right? Like it shouldn't it shouldn't come in like that. Should remain a decision that's within the sphere of the family to decide what they're going to do for their family. The sphere of the church will decide what they're going to do for their church. And if the civil magistrate was trying to decide, it would be violating what really are, I think, decisions that should be made by different authority structures. And so, would you agree with, maybe you don't like the terminology, but like just the underlying like interactions there? I would assume we agree that civil government shouldn't institute those. I know you think that maybe there can be room for instituting other things. Maybe it's also difference of level. Like I guess maybe you might say that at local levels maybe more can be enforced than at broader levels. But I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I think on the baptism question, or that would deal with whether or not civil power has that in principle. And it's a good question. Like, could they compel baptism of infants of Baptists? Could they in principle? Probably not. I have to think about that. I think they probably couldn't do that practically. It'd probably create a lot of problems, especially if there's a lot of Baptists. I would hope at least that Baptists would resist that, simply because they have they're convicted on that point, so they would resist it very thoroughly. But yeah. But yeah, can they? I think that's a question of yeah. So, but I mean, there's other things where you could throw out. You could talk about family. Just it would be bad for families to do that. And if we determine that if you force, yeah, like if you force like what vocation some son's gonna have, like, oh well, he, from on high, it's like, well, he's gonna be this and he's gonna be that and there's gonna be this and that's. They force upon that. Is that an abuse of power in principle? I'm not entirely sure, but it would certainly be a bad thing for society to force vocations upon people. And that would be very easy to, I think, to determine. It would also be resisted because it would, because people are being forced to do something they don't want to do. And so in that, it wouldn't work and it would be bad for society. So again, it's like, that's how, this is why I like, if we're going to say we're like a political animal, that means we're going to involve ourselves in politics and assert what we think is good. And if something's obviously bad, we're going to resist it, and we should. And so I'm just not. Yeah, I mean, these are all like good questions. I just wonder if the way like we understand the dynamics of politics is different, because I think that like if I'm understanding correctly, you're trying to find like these absolute principles to deny authority in principle, where I'm saying that the way these things work out practically can be examined to one, be resisted, and also to be shown that they are actually bad for society. And I think that's actually, in a way, a healthier way to even do politics, that people can reflect upon a law or some civil order and see, wait a second, that's just bad, and they can seek to change that through the various means that they have. So I hope that kind of makes sense. I just hesitate to say like, no, they can't do that. They can't do this. They can't do that. Well, but why? And I think that it would be the way we evaluate whether something is good or bad needs to be far more on, well, what effect would this have? Not so much the authority in the abstract, but the effect it would have on an ordinary society. And so yeah, does that kind of make sense?
so.
I wonder
I
if
think
that's
it
like what
does.
we're kind of getting to the question,
Yeah.
maybe, where like the question is whether these things that we would both agree are bad, or do we say they're bad because they're bad in effect, or because they're bad simply by the nature of authority itself? So I don't know.
Right.
Do you
Well,
think
that's
that makes
even.
sense? That may be the question we're at or after.
I think that does make sense, and that's even a divide within libertarianism. And I think just even in all ethical frameworks, I think there's often a sort of push and pull between those who maybe take more of a deontological approach, which is kind of what I'm doing, where it's like I'm trying to establish like what are the normative, uh, rule sets, right? Like what's right and what's wrong, and the motivation for that is that if we know what's right and wrong, we can sort of operate on that and then avoid conflict. Whereas if we have not a clear understanding of what's right and wrong, we have more of a maybe you wouldn't like this word, but I guess the one word that comes to mind, because it's opposed to the deontological approach, be more of a consequentialist view. My worry there is that it creates too many uh, calculations that one has to make, and it can kind of muddy the ground in terms of like where you operate, and so it can create more conflict, and then it could be that can be, I mean, it could be bad for society. And also I feel like from a Christian that although I wouldn't say that the Bible is like an exhaustive political philosophy, I do think that there are moral principles that I feel like apply consistently in human life. And I want to understand what those principles are and make sure that I am following them as a Christian. I do think you're more or less correct in your characterizations. I think partly also what I'm bringing in, because we both agree using biblical principles and reason and philosophy. So I have a quote here from Rothbard I wanted to run by you, which kind of gets to another one of the areas where we might disagree, because the way you describe government and politics is very much like, because you said this when we talked, like libertarians might tend to, in your view, focus too much on the individual, and that we are social creatures, and we do kind of act on sort of social goods, and should we and you'll often use this, you'll describe it like, well, if we decide this is good or bad, we should do something. And I do have a disagreement with that approach. I could put it in my own words, but Rothbard has a quote in his book, Anatomy of the State, which I think sums it up perfectly. This sort of problem of kind of saying we are, the government, or government is sort of the actions that we take together. So he says, quote, if then the government does something which you disapprove of, you must still admit that you did it. Hence, anything done by the government or its agents must be considered as if you were personally doing it. But if we are the government, then anything a government does to an individual is not only just, it's untyrannical and voluntary on the part of the individual concerned. And so we must conclude that if government has committed murder, then the victim is the criminal, for he must have done it to himself, since we are the government and the government only acts on our behalf. Now, I don't think that you would agree with that characterization of what your view is, and I'm not saying that's necessarily what you're saying, but it's a danger, right? And I think you would even agree there's like elements of democracy and sort of the liberal order we live in, or like modern liberal order, maybe not liberal in the traditional sense, but where we do this, right? Like we're taught that, like, it's government is what we do, it's we the people, and we're acting together. And maybe there's an element of that you think is true and you want to argue for that. But I guess this quote from Rothbard demonstrates the principle where I think there's a danger there, which is influencing what I'm doing. It's like I tend to, I tend to, kind of have more of a deontological approach where I want the clear rules of right and wrong so I know how to act. And then B, I'm a little bit hesitant of the collectivist rhetoric, because it can, if you take that too far, it kind of breaks down the barrier between government and people to the point where I don't know what framework you could use to resist what government does, which I know you agree. You have a whole section in your book about political resistance, and that's a traditional reformed view even. So I know we agree on that, but I guess I'm just, to me, I think I see some inconsistencies or at least some dangers. So I wonder what your response to that would be.
Yeah, no, that's a good quote. It seemed that was Rothbard, that you said.
Yeah, it's from Anatomy of the
Yeah,
State, which I
yeah. I mean, that
have
strikes me
somewhere
as
here.
like a kind of Rousseauian assumption of political order. So, like, Rousseau essentially he wanted to retain, like, he wanted to essentially retain freedom of the people. So they in a sense give their freedom, but they get it back because the state sort of embodies the will of the people.
Right.
And I wouldn't agree with that. And the way I frame it in the book is that the civil government is a type of mediator for the good of the people, but it's not the people themselves dictating the precise policies of the government. They essentially grant this set of people or this government a type of power over them for their good, and they can kind of communicate different goods that they want in the end. But it comes down to the actual government to enact a specific policy or law for that good. And so I think that creates a separation in a way between the people and the actual laws created. The people express consent to a body of people, to some sort of political entity, or to some government, whatever, to enact laws for their good, but that separates them from the actual particulars of it. That, it's like it's saying I want. It's like expecting, it's like it's expecting some ruler to do good, but not without dictating the principle. Otherwise your ruler would be a type of delegate. So like you have, like, the people outline a platform. They say, we want this stuff. And then they say, you person, you're delegated to enact this. And then it happens. That would be a situation in which, yeah, you take responsibility because you've outlined the details. Whereas the whole purpose of representative government is that they would be a kind of intermediary between the people for their good. So it would circle around, but that intermediary step is that they're not responsible for those individual, like, the enactments, if that makes sense. That's how I would overcome that, and I think I do articulate that in the book. So it's not this kind of like Rousseauian model, which I think Rothbard's kind of assuming there. So I don't think there's an inconsistency there as far as I can see. It would be, I get I mean, this is why Rousseau's been criticized, and he actually tried to deal with it in his book, Social Contract. But this is the pitfall of a type of Rousseauian model, and maybe Kantian as well. But yeah, that's how I would resolve that.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's like I agree that you're not trying to, fully, you're not saying word for word what Rothbard is critiquing here, but I guess I would just disagree a little bit with, I don't know that what your answer does resolves the tension, because I think that if it would create, to me, a sort of problem where if so you're describing that people are essentially like, they're not consenting in the way that, like, well, this is just us doing it, but rather it's like they have these representatives, and they have expectations for those representatives to do something. But you say, well, it's not like they're just delegated, though, like they are given power to rule and to do this. But I think that then creates, so then you're back to I think there's two possibilities. The one possibility is that the people are not beholden to the representatives are not beholden to the people, in which case then you've just created a system where you have a lot of rulers rather than one, and that creates a problem, which I think you even agreed with when you had a talk with Alex, where it's like you said we live under a type of tyranny, but it wouldn't be prudent to enact the right for political resistance or revolution right now, because, like, how would you, who would you go after? Like, it's not just one person, it's a lot of people. And that's my problem there, is that on the one hand, you can create a system where it's just like, you just have a rule of a lot of different rulers rather than one ruler, which can actually be, I think this is why Hoppe and a lot of libertarians criticize democracy and even constitutional democracy, because it doesn't always necessarily, maybe it starts out limited, but sometimes it grows to an extent where it becomes more tyrannical than a lot of monarchs were. But then on the flip side, I guess the other way you could kind of put it is that that they're representatives of the people, and so they have to reflect the will of the people. But then I guess I feel like it's a distinction without a difference in terms of, comparing it to, it's just the people doing the government. Like you're saying the representatives are just like, federal heads of the people. You can almost make a comparison to how atoms are federal head. But it would still seem to be blurring the lines, which is partly why I also make such a appeal to wanting a deontological model, because if you're going to have that, I could, because I never want to make perfect the enemy of the good, but I still feel like if we're going to have that, then we at least need clear moral rules and like a roadmap to kind of know when the civil rulers are like more or less doing okay and when they're kind of going off the road. And I guess you're trying to resolve that by saying we should look at the effect and not the not the power itself. But I don't know that you can make such a clear-cut delineation. Also, you would have to judge those effects by some sort of moral apparatus too, I guess. So, but I threw a lot out there. I don't know if you have anything you want to pick up and respond to.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that there is so if you select, I think the moral responsibility of the people comes down to if they were wise in who they selected as their ruler. But I think it's perfectly consistent to say that, and this is true for anything, for you choosing an HVAC technician to a plumber to anything, that you don't know how to fix the problem and you don't know how to fix the AC yourself. But you can kind of look over the options, and in the end, if you choose the wrong guy, it's like, I chose the wrong guy. But and so there is a type of responsibility in that, but you're not responsible for the actual failure to fix the plumbing, the pipe problem yourself. That's the person who failed. So that I'm not trying to separate the people from the responsibility. I just think that they don't have, like, I don't have to claim that my failure to fix the pipe is or that his failure that like in the particulars, he says as a plumber he failed, but you can go back and say, okay, that was unwise to choose that guy or something like that. So I think there is responsibility. It's just that responsibility is different. So in political ruler, you can select an unwise guy, but in the end, it's his failure to enact the good or his failure that he enacted evil, and you can replace that guy. So I think that's the difference. I don't think you have to own in the particulars and say, well, this is my will embodied in the man, and I have to receive it, not resist it. You just have to, in a way, correct course and choose someone else. So I think that's all consistent. I think it's consistent with the way we operate in the world. Like even CEOs, like you have a board of a director for some corporation, they as a board cannot be a CEO. So they choose a CEO, and he can either be good or bad. And if they figure out that, okay, that was an unwise choice, they replace him. They don't have to take full responsibility to the particulars of his action. They have to take responsibility for choosing the wrong guy. So I think that's all consistent. You don't have to what's that?
Well, I kind of get the comparison, but isn't it sort of different in type? Because like with a business CEO, like, yeah, like, say I have stock, like enough stock that I can have some kind of vote or something in I'm a shareholder and vote for the CEO. Well, if there's a bad CEO and the business goes in the wrong direction, I have an easy opt out where I can sell my shares and invest them somewhere else, right? Same with anything. Like if I hire a bad plumber, it's not like I'm then maybe like one time I hire a bad plumber, he does a bad repair. Well, I'm not then like forced to keep using the bad plumber for 2 years or for 4 years or whatever. Or, Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, which is crazy to me. But I guess that's the difference, is that I'm not then like, yeah, you can make bad choices, but with the representative model, you're then kind of straddled to your bad choice. And it's like, well, you chose him, so now, like, you don't have to like him, and you can eventually replace him, but for this period of time, you have to accept his rule I mean, would
Yeah.
we at least agree that if, like, let's say you and I vote someone in, and then he does a 180, and it's like, let's say he ran on a platform of banning abortion in our state if we lived in the same state, and then he gets in, and instead he does the opposite. He actually, deregulates abortion and makes it easier to access and promotes more funding to it. Like, would we at least agree that, like, maybe it wouldn't be prudent to try to pull him out? But would we be able to say, all right, this person, we voted for him, but his role is no longer legitimate in a moral sense?
Yeah, I mean, if he becomes a full on tyrant, then yeah, I think that this is just the way that. I mean, I don't want to go back to what I said earlier, but I mean, a constitutional order is in a way of mitigating risk. So obviously, there's high risk in giving someone a lot of power, and this is why we have the constitutional order itself, is to kind of, because we all know from experience that you often get a guy in there who's not good, and so you try to mitigate that risk through the checks and the various ways of curtailing his power significantly, or to remove him eventually. So I just think that's the nature of politics, and there's no easy solution. There's no perfect
Sure. Yeah, I
solution
agree
to
with
that,
that.
because obviously, like, the guy's bad, you want to remove him now. I'd love to remove Biden and Kamala right now. The question is, would it be is the good more likely to be realized if we did some sort of revolution now, or would it be best if we just waited out 4 years, hope to win in win this election and reverse it? So it's all just yeah, again, it's just the nature of politics itself, and it's a calculation of when do you act, and do you just follow through and you replace them next time. So it's yeah, I don't know how to get around that, and
Well,
that's
I guess
just the
to
nature
me,
of it.
it's like I agree that our form of government is, yeah, it's sort of like a trade-off, right? I love that Thomas Sowell quote. There's no solutions, only trade-offs, and I tend to agree with that. There is no perfect system, and there are plenty of systems that could probably definitely be worse than ours. But it does seem to me that there's at least part of the problem with the system as it's played out over the last couple hundred years is that it's sort of created, people call it the duopoly or the uniparty, but it seems like we have a choice, but we kind of don't have a choice, if you know what I mean. I mean, even a lot of Republicans, it's hard to differentiate them from their Democratic opposition, other than, maybe they get really sensational in their rhetoric on a couple of issues. But then in terms of how they govern, it, I'm not even saying, like, there are small differences, right? Like, I can point to differences between Trump and Biden and their administrations, even in ways where I would come out sounding like I preferred Trump over Biden. But there's also just so much that's similar that it's like, is this really the best that we can do? I guess is where I end up, and maybe it's a little bit utopian to think we're going to have the full Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist model, but that's why I tend to go like, well, if the best we can do is federalism, maybe this is a point we can end on agreement on. Like, maybe federalism and constitutionalism is the best sort of like middle ground where we're going to find between totally, decentralized or totally centralized. But at least right now, it seems like we need to do what we can to, like, I would say, at least decentralize power more back to the states, and back to the localities, and have government be more done in those local arenas rather than through Washington, D.C., which our Constitution would allow for. I think the problem is no one's enforcing the original intent of the Constitution. So would we agree on that that's at least a better path forward than the status quo?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. I think that restoring federalism, I would say particularly how it operated in the early 19th century. I like that's kind of, if there is a sort of golden era, certainly wasn't perfect, but at least in terms of political order, I like the early 19th century. And so I would totally agree with that. And that would be because I think, well, I mean, one of the issues today, this is why like politics is, you can't like, you always have to kind of understand the way things are now and how they're different earlier. I think now you have just incredible reach with the not just centralized government, but centralized, just call it the regime, as I've called it, other people have. You have centralized media. You have just the whole weird JD Vance thing that has come out, where now everyone is calling him weird, and you have this like sort of 24-hour news cycle where people forget all the bizarre, weird stuff that Democrats have done over the last 5 years. But all of a sudden, a guy who has a seemingly good family life is now weird, even though the weirdness of there's just incredible control and unity among just the regime broadly. And that's, I would say that's very unique to our time. And when we try to like extract political principles in a timeless way without considering the uniqueness of our own situation, I think we can kind of run into problems. But yeah, I do agree that the federal system be better. The point I was getting at is that if you kind of decentralize authority in our country now, that means people are more interested in their county policies and their state policies, as opposed to the national ones, which means that the national media has less relevance because what's particular to Missouri or Texas or North Carolina is going to be different than what the people in Massachusetts or California want. But now we're so obsessed with national politics that people don't care so much about their own local. Also, it kind of like sucks the energy out of where it captures the attention for national politics. Whereas really the things that impact you a lot, at least for my area, is going to be county and state politics. So I completely agree that should be the path forward, where we kind of push for more decentralization. But I would also say, and I don't know if we disagree on this, I guess, but like one of my concerns with having a very abstract discussion of politics is it means that like we say that at the federal government should not have these sets of powers. But I would say that in the local, in the state and county region, that they should have those kind of powers. So
I would tend to agree.
I think let me just explain. Just what I mean is, like I said earlier, the building a big gas station with lights all over across the street. I mean, you can see behind me that I live out in the woods. I wouldn't want a huge Chevron station out there, even if it economically makes sense. If they're going to put a gas station there, somehow the county thinks that would be good for everyone, then they should do it mindful with law and regulations such that it doesn't disrupt, it doesn't overly kind of disrupt our community. And so I think that power to say, okay, we know that's your property, but if you're going to build, if we allow you to build at all, that sort of thing, it's going to have to be according to this design, this structure, this lighting, this noise. And that power should be there. So this is one reason why I think Republicans and conservatives get in trouble and actually create sometimes very ugly communities, because they take that fear of government that they have at the federal level and they bring it all the way down to the county level or the state level. And what that means then is they're kind of subject to really powers that are outside their county, outside their state, even sometimes outside their nation. When really you have to, it's sort of, the county can be ordinarily a very strong countervailing power to people who don't live in your county, who want to buy 100 acres and build, like some horrible housing project or whatever it is, commercial district. And so you need to be thinking in terms of, we need a sort of countervailing power to outside forces to shape our community in the way we want it to be, so it's beautiful and good. So that kind of outlines. So again, decentralization without limiting too far the powers of the local level for you to order, the place that you live.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think you laid it out well there. Like I was saying earlier, I tend to agree that at the local level you can kind of be more hands-on, because even in sort of the libertarian anarcho-capitalist model, so like Hans Hermann Hoppe describes covenant communities, which some libertarians describe as, well, that's authoritarianism, because the way Hoppe describes it is that it's like, yeah, in the local community actually, because at a local level, you actually can, you don't have to invoke some kind of social contract. You actually can say people are collaborating together and kind of consenting to sort of the rule of the local, uh, you know, magistrate. There can be a lot of rules and ordinations and things you're not allowed to do, within that local level, and that's easier to enact, and that doesn't come with a lot of the same trade-offs that you would have if you gave that same sort of power to a federal government to try to, wield that power over, 330 million people over a whole, half a continent. So I think that there's a lot of there's definitely disagreements on like where we're like sort of like our first principles approach to a lot of this stuff, but then in terms of like brass tacks, like in terms of like libertarians of my milieu and sort of right wing paleocons and populists, maybe more of your milieu, there seems to be I think a general consensus on how we ought to move forward in terms of what's more what's a practical way forward to sort of like resist the federal tyranny while not, doing so in a way that backfires against us. We're
Yeah,
at
and
the end
if
of
I
our
can speak
time.
to that, if you don't mind, I don't
Yeah,
mean to interrupt. I want to. I think
no,
it's
go
an
ahead
important
and
point. So I've
yeah, if
been
you want to
thinking more
just
and more.
yeah, go
I'm
ahead,
sorry.
and then you can kind of if you want to go ahead and give that, and we'll kind of count that as like your closing thought, and then we'll close out.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I saw. I just didn't. I wanted to. I wanted to focus on this because. So I apologize for interrupting, but I
No,
think
you're
this is
fine.
just an important point. I've been reflecting a lot on the relationship of the neocons and the paleocons. I did a video on my YouTube about this that came out yesterday, but they're also within that people don't know this history. There was a type of unity between people who are kind of broadly speaking paleo-conservative and people who paleo-libertarian. This was in was it Rockford Institute back in the day? I think I don't know if that still exists, but
It's
it was for
it was
several.
Lou Rockwell, and it was through like the Lou Rockwell report and the Mises Institute, and Rothbard and Pat Buchanan and all them were
Right. So there
Paul
was like this
Gottfried.
old
Yep.
there was this a type of alliance, and probably more than alliance, a type of friendship, and like real unity between these different groups, and it kind of splintered in the early '90s, partly because Pat Buchanan believed in a stronger industrial policy, and paleocons, I guess, reflected somewhat in the national conservative side. They do tend to be pro kind of in like national industrial policy, and I'm sympathetic to that. So, but to a certain extent, but I do think that like you and I talking and talking these things out in a kind of respectful, friendly way is I do see hope that a type of paleo libertarian or right wing libertarian, we can actually, we don't have to be adversarial, that we actually agree on a lot. And there might be like you said, first principles where we differ on philosophical points that we can debate, and that's all fun and good. But ultimately, like just like all the paleocons, we're just like you guys. We're all Americans. We all have sympathy for a type of classical liberalism. We all want to see virtuous and pious people. We all want to live in safe neighborhoods. We all kind of have the same general vision over in terms of like what we want our country to look like, I think. And so I think it's really good that we can stop being adversarial and talk like you and I have, and and kind of correct each other where we think we're in error or disagree, this or that, but still build something together. And it would be really great as a, I guess, a younger generation to remember that history and kind of restore what once was. Because it really, like, when we splinter into these different factions, it just doesn't. It's essentially the enemy. Our common enemy is essentially dividing and or we're dividing and conquering we're dividing ourselves and allowing ourselves to be
Right.
ineffective. So
Yeah.
I think it's really good. And if this is kind of the end of it, I appreciate you inviting me on again. And I hope these are productive among whatever I am and the libertarians.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you said there. I punch left, and I probably, especially towards the sort of right wing, the part of the right that like you would be part of. I guess I don't punch. I just I don't know. It's a ruler slap, maybe, like if you're in school or something. But I don't know the right metaphor. But yeah, and I agree. It's like these are good discussions to have. To I find them edifying. It's good to within the right to not to foster good, healthy communication where we're not necessarily, a monolith and we're not an echo chamber, but we do need to kind of like keep our sights on what we do have in common and move towards that. Because at the end of the day, yeah, like we want the same things. We want a safe neighborhood, a good society, a moral society for our kids and our grandchildren to be raised in, so that they can do the things that we all especially agree on, the most important things, which is to live for heavenly things, to be able to live quiet lives serving the Lord and proclaiming the gospel, and to the edification of our communities and ultimately the world. And so that's we have to keep that in mind, I think. I greatly appreciate you coming back on, Stephen, to have this conversation. If you want to plug quick before we hop off, because you mentioned your YouTube channel, if you want to tell people where they can find you. I actually subscribed to it, and I have enjoyed the few episodes that I've tuned in and listened to. You'll sometimes do. I like the ones you do where you'll take the different articles people read and kind of long form kind of go through it line by line. Yeah. I've enjoyed those.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So let's see, what is it? What do I have? It's I renamed it. It's called The Lone Bulwark.
Great name,
you'll find it on YouTube. I'm also on Twitter. You can probably find me. I'm the guy with, I think there's several Stephen Wolves, but I'm the one with my arms crossed. You'll see me. Yeah, but that's basically it. Yeah, I'm trying to develop the YouTube channel as best I can. I try to increase as best I could the production value and all that. I'm working hard. So eventually I hope to do a type of scholar series where I kind of get down into kind of academic stuff, more academic stuff that people might be interested in. So stay tuned for that.
Awesome. Well, yeah, everyone, make sure you check out Stephen's work, even read his book. I highly recommend it, even though, obviously areas of disagreement, but there's also, especially the ending part, I think Alex and I both have, like little schoolgirls, sort of like, gushed about the ending to the book that speaks against the American imperialism and global global order that we're all united against. Definitely, everyone should check that out. And yeah, thanks again, Stephen, for being on. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll talk again next time.
Yeah, thanks again.